put 19, it's basically the whole chapter. I don't know that we'll get to all of this because it's been a storyline, and it's still a story. So we'll look at it. But the idea in this Bible study, and in this whole chapter, if I were to sum it up and say what it's about loyalty. Absalom's dead. David and his ragtag army have won. The men of Israel who were with Absalom from the other 10 tribes, because basically David's military that he had in place there were from Judah and from Benjamin. And the rest of the 10 tribes that basically sided with Absalom, they and all those guys who had survived the battle had fled to their homes, and they're sort of left in this place, of victory, but he's still in another country, and we pick up in that story, and basically, but we ended with David in mourning, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son. When you get to chapter 19, that has some repercussions. And right in the very first verses, it says, Joab was told the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because that day the troops had heard the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men who steal in, who are shamed when they flee from the battle. And the king covered his face and cried out loud, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." So the scene is, they win the battle. This should be a time of great celebration. You have these guys, there was several thousand involved, but you have basically this small sort of ragtag army who defeated Absalom and his massive army of all the armies of the other 10 tribes of Israel. And they've celebrated a victory, and they've saved their king, and they've saved their kingdom, and they've done all of this, and they should be, marching into the city and celebrating. But David, once he hears that Absalom is dead, goes into a room above the gate of the city and is weeping and wailing for his son. And the word gets out that David is mourning for Absalom. And here the guys who love him and serve him and have sacrificed and, fought this battle, won for him, can't celebrate. It's like their victory is stolen from them. And David can't see it. That's a tough place to be. They're sneaking into the city like they had run from the battle. And Joab wasn't going to have it, and Joab comes and gives them some personal advice. Now, Joab has been sort of a loyal employee to David for many, many years, since the time that David was being pursued by Saul. But Joab isn't particularly a man to be trusted. For instance, if you go back to 2 Samuel 3, I think it is, when Saul was fighting against David, and even after Saul was killed and that battle was won and that was over, one of his generals, trying to remember who it was, Abner, kept on fighting. Saul was dead, but Abner kept fighting David. And finally, when it was over, he fled to a city of refuge. Well, in a city of refuge set by the law, that almost anybody could go to a city of refuge, and particularly if it was accidental or something that happened in a time of war or false accusation, or if somebody was killed and it was an accident, they could flee to a city of refuge so the family couldn't take revenge. Sometimes when you read in the Bible studies, it's basically you couldn't kill them without a trial. That's an American thing. That's not the issue here. It wasn't so much that they would go and stand trial for what they had done, but if you was eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and you kill my brother, we can kill you. And that was sort of the law of the land. But if you fled to a city of refuge, there were 7 of them in Israel, you were safe. You just couldn't leave the city. It gave you a place of yeah, it's like it was a place where God was giving people the opportunity of receiving grace. Okay, and Joab goes to the city of refuge and kills Abner in the city of refuge. But because it's all in a time of war, that didn't sit well with David. But it was a time of war, and he sort of let it slide. And Joab is the one who kills Absalom, or stabs him and gets starts the process of him being killed. Joab isn't really a guy you can trust. He's sort of been faithful, but in this instance, he sort of sees what's going on, and he goes to David. Now David is mourning for his son. He's the king. He's won the battle, which means he's going to get to go back and be king again. And his general comes and says, "Today, you have humiliated all of your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now, go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord, if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth until now." You want to talk about courage, to go into somebody who's mourning and literally wailing in pain and set him straight. Joab, his head general. That takes courage, because he doesn't just say, "David, you've humiliated all of us. You got to get your head together, get your act together." He goes through this whole litany of, you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? Interesting concept, makes you think of people who, say they love America, but everything they do is to benefit somebody other than Americans, in that sense. You could put that in a lot of circumstances, but we've seen that. You just sort of see that kind of a thing, and David is right there. He's mourning over the enemy, even though the enemy was his son, and not celebrating with his men. And, Joab is saying, hey, if you don't get this together, there's not going to be a man here left. You're going to alienate everybody. That's a tough conversation to have with anybody. That's a tough conversation to have. It's tough to go in and say to someone, and I've had to do it a couple of times in different situations, whether it's get off your high horse, and listen to people, or stop making everything about you. I can tell you how many times in the course of events in life, and you know how it is, somebody does something and the situation gets so bad that it's because there's somebody in that situation who doesn't think of anybody else or turns everything to something about them, and it all sort of explodes. And Joab is not pulling any punches. David, dude, if you don't get this straight, I promise you there won't be one of us left. This will be worse than everything that has happened to you. And Joab has been with him all the way along. That's courage. And that is loyalty, in the sense that it would take somebody very courageous and loyal to go into the king and say that. Because he keeps saying that. You have made it clear. You would rather we'd all be dead. Ooh. When you're saying something like that to somebody, number one, you better be standing on righteous ground, and not something, I've had people teach this and just say, well, if you're in the right and you need to correct somebody, you need to do this. Well, I don't say that. This is, you better be on righteous ground when you do this. If you have to go into somebody and say, get off your high horse, or stop making it all about you, or you see what I mean? It has to be. Joab was not the best guy in the world, But in this case, he was spot on. And it worked. In verse 8 it says, so the king got up and took his seat in the gateway, and when the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. It said, meanwhile, the Israelites on the other side had all fled to their homes all over the country. But as soon as they heard the king was sitting in the gateway, that's where he should have been, in the gateway, greeting the guys as they left. Now, when you think about what Joab said, it makes perfect sense. Because as they were leaving, they were in a place called Mahanaim. It's not in Israel. He's on the other side of the Jordan. And as all the men were leaving, and the scripture told us how he divided them into groups of hundreds and groups of thousands and appointed commanders over all of them. You know, he divided and organized the army, one to lead them, and they said, no, you stay here. You know, if we lose you, we lose everything. And so he stays there. But as each group that he's organized marches through the gate to go to war, he's calling out and telling the commanders, don't touch a hair on Absalom's head. You make sure the boy is safe. Don't touch the boy. Don't touch the young man who's leading the rebellion. So these guys go into this battle against somebody who's sworn to destroy their king with their hands tied. You know, at least they're emotional hands. How would that make you feel? You know, so then they come back and they've won, and David is ignoring them and mourning the enemy. So by him coming out of that upper room and going down and sitting there at the gate, so that as the guys came in, as soon as they heard, the ones who come in came out, they all came out and greeted him. And we don't get the idea of how that all went, but seeing him there and he's congratulating them, he got his act together. You know, I imagine he washed his face and he went down there and was suddenly high-fiving the guys instead of sitting in his room crying. Okay. And sometimes you've got to do that. Sometimes we have to, I mean, there's something here, and I don't really ever remember seeing anybody touch on it, on this side of it. But we have to do what David did. We have to set ourselves aside, whatever our experience is, you know, and go do what needs to be done. I saw a quote by Winston Churchill today that said, you know, sometimes it's not good enough to do your best. Sometimes you just have to do what has to be done. And it's far beyond your best. You just have to do what's required. And, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of situations where that can take place. You know, whether, you know, it can be in a situation of work, it can be in a situation of family. There are just times I know in my family, and you know, there's 8 of us in the house. It isn't always peaceful, but I had to come to the conclusion that it didn't matter how I felt. When things started exploding in the house, if I go down, the house goes down. So it doesn't matter really what I think or how I feel. I have to be solid. I'll deal with how I feel. I will own that. I'm not going to let somebody else control it or manipulate it. I will own it. And I will deal with it. But at the moment, I'm not going to deal with how I feel. I'm going to get everybody back on a calm basis and back on an operational basis and back treating each other nicely. You know, that's what David had to do. And I really don't remember anybody ever saying that. And I'm not sure everybody would agree with me. In the sense of sometimes that's what you've got to do. You know, in our world it says however you feel. You know, the heart wants what the heart wants, and do by how you feel. And I don't believe that at all. I believe we have to do what's right. And that's what Joab was telling David. David, I know you're hurting. I know you're hurting for your son. But you put that aside, set it aside, and go deal with your men. And sometimes that's the way of teaching it. Put it aside and deal with life. You know, I love movies. It makes me think of a Star Trek movie, one of the newer Star Trek movies. And I don't know what has happened, but Kirk is gone and Spock is the captain and he's just being Spock. And finally the doctor confronts him and about everything that's going on. And Spock says, well, if you think it would be better if I walked around the ship weeping and moaning, I will gladly do that if that's what you think I should do. This was like, no, that's not the idea. But you have to set yourself aside. That's what David did. And that starts the ball rolling. Now, the situation is David has won. He's gotten his men right, but he's still on the other side of the Jordan. He's not in Jerusalem. He's not back as king. See? And that's what makes it interesting, And he begins to send out some messages. I think in verses 11 to 15, we get in there. I know in verse 9, between verse 8 and 9, my version has a subheading that says, David returns to Jerusalem. Well, he doesn't return to Jerusalem until the end of the chapter. But the process of returning to Jerusalem isn't easy. He had 10 of the 12 tribes trying to kill him. Who's going to be loyal? What's he going to do? And so he does that. And so David sends a message to the priests we were talking about last week, Zadok, one of those guys, the priests in Jerusalem who had helped David escape and got the spies going for him. And he sends Zadok the priest a message. And he says in the message, ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout of Israel has reached the king in his quarters? You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood, so why should you be the last to bring back the king? So he's getting there, he's sort of getting his act together, and the 10 tribes have sort of scattered back to their homes, and you would think that Judah and the elders of Judah would be saying, come on back. Everybody's telling him to go on back except for his family. So he sends to the priest, say, hey, go to the elders of Judah. Go, what is going on here? In that message, he also says, and say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army for life in place of Joab. So David is trying to motivate the elders of Judah to help bring him back, because he's hearing from people, but not his very family. And he says to this guy Amasa, and I was trying to remember the history of Amasa. He was literally one of Saul's generals, but he was sort of loyal to David, and there's all kinds of things. And he says to Amasa, who's one of his family members, I'm going to make you my commander-in-chief in place of Joab. See, David's going to deal with Joab. Joab has killed somebody in the city of refuge. Joab has killed Absalom, his son. David knows that. And so Joab is going to, at some point, pay for what he's done. So David is saying, you guys, why haven't you called me back? Why haven't you done that? And tell this guy that's what I'm going to do. We've been, David is basically telling them, hey, I've had your back all this way. You've had my back. Where are you guys now? You guys stayed. And Amasa was, now that I think about it, actually David's nephew. And so he's promising him to be the commander. Now, that's it. He wants to return to Jerusalem. As he goes to return to Jerusalem, some interesting things begin to happen. He picks up his army, they leave the city, and they go to the River Jordan. Now, I've seen pictures of the River Jordan, and there are times when the River Jordan is in flood stage, and you don't want to get close to it. There are other times when the River Jordan in the middle of late summer is still barely crossable, but it's crossable, and he moves his household and the army and everybody that's with him out of the city, goes to the River Jordan. And he's experienced rebellion, betrayal, anger, rejection from all of these people. But once he crosses over Jordan, in a symbolic sense, he truly becomes king of the land again. He faces a real problem. Same problem we face today. How do you take a nation divided and heal it? I remember studying about the end of the Civil War when Robert E. Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox. And there was a lot of cry from leaders in the North and others that the South should really be punished. You should just go in there and just, do all kinds of bad things. But Abraham Lincoln and Grant and some of the others knew the war was over, but the animosity was there. And they needed to heal the land. So when they ended the war and Lee surrendered and the South surrendered, the soldiers were allowed to keep their weapons and they were sent home. They didn't go after them for vengeance. They knew the nation needed to be healed. Now our nation needs to be healed, okay? And what's happening is further dividing it, but it needs to be healed. We're in that situation David was. How do we bring this together? How do we become one nation again? And David is faced with being the returning king, and he's got all of these people, both individuals and groups of people, that have been against him. And the one thing that's admirable about David, and it shows that now he's probably 60 something at this point. And he was a man after God's own heart. What David did was he gave them grace. Now, the first group he gave grace to, and it sort of comes across sort of funny, but it's in, 8 to 14 and 41 to 43. I call it giving grace to the unable. The unable, I mean, by all of those men in the army of Israel that had come against him that had survived the battle, had all fled to their homes. And if you read through those verses, what you find is David initiates meetings with the leaders of those tribes and the leaders of Judah to reconcile and to recognize them and to let them know he's not coming after them. He initiates that. How do you approach someone to get their favor when you have rebelled against them? How would they do that? How would they come to David? They couldn't. So David initiated that to do what they were unable. He organized a meeting with his own tribe and with those tribes, and and began to give them grace. Now, it didn't go smoothly at first, but his first act to redo this is to start something even before he's back in Israel. Initiate some meetings to try and reunite the tribes, let them know it wasn't coming after them, basically. Then as he's waiting to cross the River Jordan, and could be waiting for the waters to go down, or, just a lot of people. It's not, 15 or 20 people. You're talking thousands of people are now waiting at the River Jordan. People start showing up. And one of the people that he gives grace to, I say he gives grace to the angry, because in verse 16 it says, Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with the steward of the house of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was, and they crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and do whatever he wished. Now, does his name sound familiar? I'll tell you who he was. When David was fleeing the city, and he gets up over the top of the hill, there was a guy standing on the hill, yelling down curses and throwing dirt and rocks at the king and cursing him. That was this guy. As David fled the city, this guy was the one standing there throwing rocks at him and throwing dirt at him. And they were going, everybody was saying, let me kill this guy. Joab was going, let me kill this guy. David says, no, maybe God has sent him to punish me for what has taken place. That was this guy. He was so angry that he was assaulting the king, throwing rocks at the king. And David had mercy on him then. Now that this is all over, he shows up with 1,000 Benjamites and with Ziba, the guy in charge of Saul's household and Jonathan's household, and is there to help the king take the household across the river. Now, there would be, they said, at the ford, which means there was a place that was shallow enough that they could walk. But we've seen around here in floods, I know that you can have 4 inches of rushing water will take you off your feet. I've been in the Kings River, in Sequoia and Kings Canyon. There are places we go in the river because it's relatively calm. There are places that jump off 15-foot rock because it's calm right there. But I've also been in places in the river where you had to hang on to somebody, you're going to be swept away. And this is a river that's minimal, probably as wide as this room. It's constantly floating. And so these Benjamites come down to help the household. Men, women, children, all their belongings, everything has to cross that river. So they come down to help the king cross the river. We think, oh, he's going to cross the river, let's go to the bridge. There were no bridges. You crossed the river, you had to go through it. And so they come to help. But this was the guy that was throwing rocks at the king, In verse 18, it says, then Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan. When they start crossing over, and all of his men are helping, he falls down before the king and said to the king, let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for your servant knows that I have sinned. He comes before the Lord and throws himself at David's feet, asking for mercy. Says, don't take that to heart. Here I am. I'm helping. And there were some that thought that this was all sort of a sham and fake, so that to win David's favor. Now that David was victorious, maybe he's just trying to save his own skin. And that's really good. Abishai, one of his generals, wanted to kill him. But David later says to Shimei and swears to him, makes a promise and an oath to him, you're not going to die. Which is David saying, I'm not going to kill you. Don't worry. And here's this guy who was so angry at him, and David gives him grace. He gives grace to those who aren't able to approach him. He gives grace to the people who were angry at him. He even gives grace to the betrayer. Now, this betrayer is Ziba. Now, Ziba did not betray David. Who he betrayed was Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. David had brought Mephibosheth into his household, treated him like his own son. He ate with his table. He was lame in both feet from when he was a child, and he was the only survivor in all of Saul and Jonathan's family, and David was taking care of him. And when they left the city, Mephibosheth stayed behind, and Ziba went. And when David questioned him about it, Ziba gave David the impression that Mephibosheth was changing sides. That he was going to take advantage of the situation, and he, was Saul's grandson and should be the rightful king, and made David think that he was going to take advantage of David and Absalom being out of town and try to take the kingship back. That's the implication of what he said. So he betrayed this kid, this man that David had taken in to take care of. And Ziba is there with Shimei. But as people find out that David is coming, Mephibosheth leaves Jerusalem and comes down and meets David. And David realizes, and it literally says, that he had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back. that he went into like a period of mourning. Now that sounds interesting, doesn't it? Not shaving, trimmed his beard, or washed his clothes. That was common, mourning kind of a thing. You would do that for a few days. It was, not uncommon to do. But take care of his feet? That's a weird statement, isn't it? Until you remember, he was lame on both feet when his nanny dropped him, when they were running for their life. They thought their life was threatened. And she dropped him. And so that implied there had to be something that had to be done to take care of him. And he couldn't do it himself. And he had just stopped and went into mourning for David until David returned. And he told David that Ziba had betrayed him, that Ziba had told him, the wrong thing. And, what really tells the heart of Mephibosheth is this. Ziba had helped David. Okay? He had helped David. And David had given Ziba charge of all of Jonathan's property. And he had given Jonathan all the property that had belonged to Saul. And so, Mephibosheth had income from that. Ziba was the property manager. He managed the household and all of that kind of stuff. And he had helped David at different times, but he had betrayed Mephibosheth. So David has a kinship and a loyalty to Ziba, and he had adopted basically Mephibosheth as his own and was taking him as his own. So he finally comes to the conclusion, he says, well, then we'll divide the land between the two of you. So David says, okay, I can't just write Ziba off, he's helped me, and I see that he's betrayed you, and I don't want to betray you, so I'll just divide the land. Because there's plenty. You guys could be independently wealthy. Mephibosheth's heart comes out because he tells David, give it all to him. I don't care about that. I just want to be here with you. See, in all of the craziness of David's life, in all of the people that are like Joab, pretty loyal, do some smart things, but they also do some pretty bad things. This young man, is completely loyal to David. He says, I don't want the land. I don't want the land. I don't want this stuff. I'm here. That's pretty cool. Yeah. So you see, David is responding with grace in a lot of different situations. And then there's one other time he shows grace, and that I would say grace to the generous. There was a guy, verse 31, it says, now Barzillai, the Gileadite, because they were in Gilead, had come down and gone to the river Jordan to escort him over the river. And he was the one who had, when David had crossed the river Jordan, had bought, wagon trains of donkeys with food and provision for David and his family and his followers. And he was one of the two guys that were wealthy that had helped throw all their resources at David to support him. And that's what he did. He was not even an Israelite, but he took care of him and took care of the people, and that was pretty good. And he had come down with his entourage to escort David over the river Jordan. But he was 80 years old, and he had provided, David, all the time that David was in the city, he had provided for David. He was a very wealthy man. And, David says, come with me to Jerusalem. Let me reward you. Come with me to Jerusalem. And this guy is 80 years old. I'm too old for that. I'm going to go back home. And David is going, come to Jerusalem, anything you want. And that was pretty, pretty powerful. He basically said, whatever you desire. You were there for me. I want to be there for you. And this guy says, I'm too old for that kind of stuff. I'm just going to go home. Some of the commentators pointed out that he was faithful to his promise to him. 400 years later, the prophet Jeremiah said that after the death of Gedaliah, some Israelites fled to a place called Jerum Chehem near Bethlehem. And in all the titles for this guy, that Chiham was one of them. And what the idea was that David had given Barzillai a portion of land outside of Jerusalem and his family, and it stayed in that family. And 400 years later, a group fled to that, and it was sort of, you would have to see it as I'll almost say like an embassy. No matter where you are in the world, in any country, and you cross the threshold onto an American embassy compound, you're in America. You know an idea? And David gave this guy a portion of land outside of Jerusalem that they could consider theirs. And people would go take refuge there. You get that? That's pretty cool. So I think that's what I love about this story is, you know, you have David totally self-absorbed and Joab having to come, tell him to get his act together, take care of his men, and David does. And after he does that, then he begins the process that sort of gets him out of it. Because you know how it is. You get caught up in something, particularly if it's emotional, and you get so caught up in it you can't see anything else. So Joab shakes him out of that. David sits there and greets his army and gets straightened out. Now he starts working on coming back. And he sends a letter to the elders and, you know, all of that stuff. And as he moves his group towards Jordan, people start coming to him. People who were his enemies. People who had betrayed his friends. And David starts his return as king by giving acts of grace. That's powerful. That's powerful. That's setting yourself aside, thinking it out, and working for bringing unity back together and healing and family. That's what David did. That's such a powerful story. And it's one that doesn't really get told a whole lot. But it gives us a lot of good food for thought, you know, about how we help people, how people have helped us. I've had people come talk to me and sort of, you know, get over yourself and, you know, when people have to say that, literally say, you need to get over yourself and deal with this, you know, and then you have to realize, okay, it doesn't matter how I feel about this, we got to do the right thing. You know? All of that gets David on the right course. And David begins to take the right actions to heal the nation. And he does that by giving grace. Love is the only thing that heals. Grace is the only thing that heals. You know, you can't force healing. You can't force people to get along. But you can set yourself aside and create an environment where you can make it work. And that's what David did. And I think when you read this, you begin to understand why David was considered a man after God's own heart. In a situation where it would be perfect to take revenge on those who rebelled against you. These guys led a rebellion against me. Let's take them out. I don't want this ever. I want this threat removed. David never does that. Never goes down that road. After Joab's confrontation, never goes down that road. He's constantly giving grace. Not that he doesn't make mistakes, and not that this doesn't go smoothly. It doesn't go smoothly. That's what we'll see next week. This doesn't go as smooth as it sounds when he gets back to Jerusalem. Because there's still animosity between the men of Judah and Benjamin and the men of Israel. And he's got to deal with that. And we'll find there's a troublemaker that just stirs that up, you know. You ever notice that? How you can have a situation where, you know, things may be tense and it, you know, but you might be able to deal with it. And then you get one guy who's a troublemaker. And he lights the flame. Yeah, he ramps everybody up, you know. You know, There's too many times you see somebody, and usually somebody that has a grudge, and taking advantage of the situation, and you either want to spark the flame, they were jerks because they were jerks. I remember one guy knew us up, and we were all the boys were in the Cub Scouts together, and we would have meetings, and there was a couple of families that weren't getting along, and they lived right next to each other. Now they're up Sand Canyon, they're not in tiny little homes, they're not in a tract, and I don't know that they were right next to each other, but the one family, they have a nice compound inside a wall, and there's trees and everything. This guy moved in next to them. And so he had somebody come out, and right along the wall line, he cut the trees flat along the wall line. Hey, it was over his property. He had the right. But having the right isn't always to do something, doesn't make that thing the right thing to do. And that's what David learned. He had the right to do a lot of things in this situation. He was king. He could have ordered Shimei and Ziba killed offhand with no recourse. But he gave grace instead. Having the right to do something doesn't mean that thing is the right thing to do. And that's what God wants us to understand. Because even John says, little children, don't be deceived. He who does what is right is righteous. Doing the right thing is the foundation of righteousness. Now, we need God's help to do that. We need his wisdom to do that. I'm not saying that we always know what the right thing is, but there is a sense that we have everything we need for life and godliness. We have that already. And we can live a fairly righteous life. It's pretty much doing the right thing. Problem is, we have a hard time doing the right thing all the time, and when we don't do the right thing, it's usually because we let ourselves get in the way. And then we see David. He becomes an example again. There are several times we've studied he's not the example to follow. But here he is. Once Joab gets him straightened out, he starts doing the right thing. And that's something important for us. And he set himself aside. And in that way, he was like Jesus. David was almost always, at some point, going to reflect Jesus later. Because Jesus set himself aside to die on the cross for us. He loved us enough. God sent his son. God loved us that much. Jesus loved that much to die for us. That doesn't mean that when he was hanging on the cross, he had warm fuzzies for us. But it meant he was going to do what he needed to do. Love was an action. For them, love was an action. It wasn't particularly emotion. You love somebody, you acted in their best interest at sacrifice of your own. That's what love was. The weakness of our society is we've reduced love to an emotion, to how we feel. And we can be manipulated by a song. We can be manipulated by someone who cuts us off in traffic. I discovered something that I've looked at a few times, and I've really been enjoying it. But there have been times I've been in tears doing it, because there are several songs that just are very meaningful to me, and that Kathy dearly loves. Some Righteous Brothers songs, Unchained Melody, and You've Lost That Loving Feeling is one of our hiking songs. We sing that at the top of our lungs. Hiking through the forest, we sing You've Lost That Loving Feeling. They have some important things to us. And I was put on background music, and I was looking for those songs. And what came across was, and I guess there's about 60 or 70 people doing this now. Young black girl, a rapper, they call it, her particular brand is mumble rapper, asked her to listen to some music. And so she started doing these videos. She had never heard of the Righteous Brothers, had no idea who they were. And so she puts them up and films herself as she listens to it for the first time. She was totally blown away. Who are these guys? Why haven't I heard of them? Well, we're truly wrapped in a culture. Not that that's bad, but if you many different, there's like 50 or 60 people now in specific cultures who are listening to music like that, or country music, that have never heard country music. You want to see something funny? You watch some of these people respond to, have you ever heard Chris Stapleton's Tennessee Whiskey? Where it's a love song, and he says, I was trapped in the bottle and going down and you saved me, and you're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey, as sweet as strawberry wine, as warm as a glass of brandy, and I'm high on, I'm stoned on your love all the time. It's just love song, but his voice is so strange and out there. These people were falling all over themselves, going, this is the blues. This is, gotta get out of yourself. Gotta get out of yourself, out of the box. And you discover a whole new world once you can set yourself aside. And that's what these kids were doing. They were setting themselves aside to listen to something they would never have even known existed. David set himself aside and did the right thing. Good lesson for us. That's what Jesus did. I'm going to pray and then we'll take communion. Father God, thank you again for today. Thank you for this occurrence. We touched on a lot of things in this chapter, and this took a while for all of this to take place, probably several weeks. But it writes like it happened in a day, but it was over a period of time. But we see David getting his head on straight after Joab gives him some good advice, and he starts doing the right thing. And the right thing to heal his nation was to give grace and to forgive. The right thing for us to heal our nation, the right thing for us to heal our families, is sometimes to give grace. Doesn't mean that David didn't stand for what was right. It just meant that he gave grace and forgave. For when we forgive, we break the chain of bitterness that prevents healing. Help us to learn that lesson tonight, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.